Welcome to the STEM Pathways podcast, where we delve into the fascinating world of science, technology, engineering, and math. I'm your host, Rohan Sharma, a passionate explorer of all things STEM. Each episode, we bring you captivating stories, cutting edge research, and inspiring interviews with experts and enthusiasts who are pushing the boundaries of innovation. Whether you're a student, a professional, or just curious about how the world works, join us as we unlock the mysteries of the universe and explore the endless possibilities of STEM. Let's get started. Today I'll be interviewing Rohan Angadi, who has a bachelor's in economics and mathematics from Yale and is currently working on an MBA from Stanford. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Rohan. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So to get started, I wanted to ask what made you choose your major of economics and mathematics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had a little bit of a change up in my journey to find econ and math. So throughout high school, for most of high school, I thought I wanted to be an engineer. I actually applied to Yale as an electrical engineer. I had done some summer programs before my senior year of high school that were related to engineering. And then I think the summer before I was heading to undergrad, I really started to introspectively think about what I was most interested in doing long term and also most interested in studying, like what I found most fascinating academically. I think for me, what had drove me to engineering was that it's quantitative, and that's something that I've always loved. I've always loved math. And then I think as I was thinking about it a little further, I kind of made a decision to pivot into academia, which has obviously changed as well. And as I made that pivot, I was thinking about what academic discipline I find most interesting. For me, it was mathematics. And then I kind of landed on econ and math because it was a combination of mathematics, but also using math to understand the universe around you. So it's a lot about flow of money, movement of money. It can be like game theory. It's about how people make decisions, etc. And so I think for me, it was I knew I wanted something quantitative. And I kind of decided engineering was not necessarily the perfect fit for me. And that led me into econ and math.
Yeah. Wait, so when you're in college and want to switch majors, do like a big major switch like that, how easy is that?
So that's super dependent on your college. Some colleges you apply to a specific department. The most or many colleges are like that. For example, like University of Illinois is like that. Georgia Tech is like that. You would apply to a specific department, and in that case, it can be slightly more challenging to transfer majors entirely. So if you want to go from engineering to not engineering, it would require applying to the School of Arts and Sciences, for example, or the School of Social Sciences, whatever it is. At Yale, you actually don't declare until the first semester of your junior year. You apply generally. So when you get admitted to Yale, you get admitted to Yale College as a whole. And so that made the movement a little bit easier. That made the movement really easy. Honestly, you're not declared until your junior year, so you can take whatever classes you want. And so for me, that was slightly easier. I think it's dependent on your academic context, but I think overall, a lot of college students change their minds as far as what they want to do. Before you get to college, you have limited exposure to the opportunities out there, unless you're doing a cool podcast like this. And so I think college can open your eyes to careers that you had no advance notice of, and academic disciplines you didn't have exposure to previously. And that can lead to change. Super common. Honestly, a lot of my friends found themselves in a similar situation.
Yeah. Going back to high school really quick. Obviously, if you went to Yale, you had to be pretty active in high school. And then I guess you're probably pretty active within the engineering world. What were you doing back then?
Yeah, that's a good question. Digging a little deep into my memory. And so for a little context, I actually grew up in a small town in eastern New Mexico. I'm a Title I public school kid, went to a rural low-income public school. And I think the implications of that is I grew up in a context with limited opportunities overall, both from an academic and career professional standpoint. There was very little. And so I think for me, within the school context, engaging with STEM was primarily in the classroom. I think I took the hardest classes I could. My school had maybe 4 to 5 AP courses total. I took all of those. hopped into AP Physics C with limited context in physics, etc. But then I knew I wanted to engage with the discipline a little bit more broadly, and I think that's what kind of led me the summer before I started college to have some awareness of, was engineering what I wanted to do long term. And so the summer before my senior year, I made an effort to get into some summer programs. I highly recommend that for high school students who are looking into colleges like Yale, Stanford, etc. I think one, it can be helpful for your college application, but I think two, it can be helpful just to understand like what living in a college context can be like and what that experience is like. So for me, and I also recommend applying particularly to the programs that are like subsidized, that have like support from the school or like some kind of national funding. And so I actually found a program at the University of Mississippi. I was the only kid from New Mexico there. But it was we were basically working like on a chip that went into helmets. They were trying to create like a chip to help support their concussion protocol. So to basically understand like how severe head trauma was from a particular hit during a football game. I'm a huge sports fan, so that was like right up my alley. And the University of Mississippi was super cool. And I ended up spending a month there. It was called the Heads in the Game program. And I think that was my first exposure to college life, to other people who are, interested in professional careers beyond my small hometown. And yeah, so I attribute that experience to a lot of my like career decision making early on, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. So, moving on, did you have any internships while you were in college?
Yeah, so I did something every summer. My first summer I studied abroad, so less an internship, more Spanish language learning. By early on in my freshman year, I decided econ and math. I was like
Wait, where did you
really
study
passionate
abroad?
about math. Spain. So I was in Bilbao, Spain, which was also an amazing experience. But yeah, so I my first summer I studied abroad. Highly recommend. Could not recommend more. Absolutely something everyone should do while they're in college. I then My second summer I was actually looking at math research programs, both math and econ research programs. I was interested in academia. That's what I wanted to explore. Wanted to become a professor. And then I ended up doing econ research at Yale for the entire summer, and then the year following. That was like my first exposure to academia. Fantastic experience. Also highly recommend for anyone applying to PhD programs and just more
You talk about
broadly.
what that econ research looked like.
Yeah, I absolutely can. So in my summer plus the year after, so this is my summer plus my sophomore year, or summer plus my junior year. I did two different research projects with two different professors. My first research project was on personal finance. And so it was with a School of Management professor at Yale School of Management who was interested in understanding why individual consumer behavior is different from economic theory when it comes to personal finance. And so basically the implication for us, I actually learned a lot from this project beyond the like academia scope. There were three research assistants. We each read 17 personal finance books and had to code the kind of advice that these books gave. And the professor basically used that as a baseline to say this is the kind of advice people are receiving, because these are the 50 most popular personal finance books. And then talked about like what people are actually doing with their money. So are they putting their money in annuities? Are they putting their money in mutual funds? Are they investing in stocks? And then he like wrote like a comparative essay to try to understand, using like economic principles, why people behave differently than what the advice they're getting, or why, and the ways in which they're behaving similarly. And so yeah, it was cool. I was with two other research assistants. Yeah, so that was one of my projects. The other one I'll briefly mention as well. Was actually very cool. It was in the labor economics spectrum. It was actually Wisconsin. It was basically Act 10 in Wisconsin dismantled teacher unions, or a lot of public sector unions in the state of Wisconsin. And so the project was to understand, with the dissipation of public sector unions, what was the impact on the gender wage gap for teachers in Wisconsin public schools. So basically, were teachers making less money? Were female teachers making less money than male teachers post that particular law? Super interesting project. The results were significant as well. So yeah, both really cool experiences. Got my name in a footnote for two different econ papers, which is really cool. Um, and yeah, it was a good experience. And the last thing I'll say about this, I had this experience, and to be honest, I like that kind of was the primary driver in me hopping into the professional world versus academia, or hopping into industry. I like loved my experience with research, but I honestly found it a little isolating. You're not, even though you're working with two other research assistants, a lot of it is like very individual work. I knew I kind of wanted to work in a team context, and I wanted slightly faster movement than I saw in academia. But I am grateful for the experience and giving me that exposure. And so, for example, my first research project, there were three research assistants, and one of them, Vaude Villert, is an econ PhD at MIT. So he loved the experience, and he continued onwards with the academia route. So I think it was a good experience, good exposure. The last thing I'll say to answer your internship question, before my senior year, so that covers my first two summers. My last one, I interned at BCG. So I interned at the Boston Consulting Group. I was a management consultant, and that's where I worked full time for 3 years before I headed to Stanford Business School.
Yeah. And what did you do at the Boston Consulting Group?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have honestly worked across industries. I'm a management consultant, a career I had like no awareness of before going to Yale. But can you still hear me? I might be
I
frozen.
hear you. Your video froze.
That's kind of funny. That's okay. I
Yeah, we'll just keep going.
yeah. But yeah, so I worked at the Boston Consulting Group for the last 3 years. I've worked across a myriad of industries. I had no idea what management consulting was before I got to Yale. It becomes There are a lot of kids from Yale who go to management consulting, specifically McKinsey, Bain, BCG. So it becomes like a cultural element before you're entering your junior year. But honestly, I think it's been a great first job experience, great exposure to the professional world. You work as a management consultant, you work on like large corporate problems for large corporations, and those problems can really range. My first project was at BCG was a digital transformation for a luxury wellness resort. So they basically had no mobile app, and we as a BCG team operated in like a product owner role for that specific company. I've also worked with like global philanthropies who are interested in shifting towards teacher focused initiatives, and we helped craft what that could look like for them. So yeah, consulting has been super interesting. And I'm grateful to have had that exposure in my first 3 years slash with that internship. So
Yeah. So what made you want to pursue an MBA?
yeah, so for me, so I've spent the last 3 years at BCG. I think BCG gives you a good understanding of what it's like to work anywhere in the large corporation space. And so I think that's both inclusive of like actual large corporations. So think like Walmart, Google, whatever it is. But it's also helpful in understanding how to work like in government, which is I also consider to be like a large business of sorts. And then similarly with like large philanthropies, et cetera. And so I felt like I had good exposure to those things, but what I didn't have exposure to was working in the startup space, or working specifically with like small companies that have like very different problems. And I saw entrepreneurship as a potential route that I was interested in. I actually have a visual disability. I have Stargardt's disease, which I'm pretty vocal advocate for. And with Stargardt's, I've always been interested in accessibility tech, so technology related to like screen readers, etc. And I think like with the AI applications to accessibility are boundless, and so I saw an interest in entering the entrepreneurship space specifically from an accessibility lens. And business school is a great opportunity to test that out. I think Stanford in particular has like a hefty proportion of the student body who are passionate about the entrepreneurship space. And so yeah, I went to Stanford. I'm doing a joint MBA and a master's in education. I'm interested in, number one, testing out entrepreneurship. Number two, also interested in investing. And so like understanding the VC side of propping up startups and entrepreneurship. And so I think for me, I love BCG. BCG is actually paying for my MBA, and so I will be going back to BCG for a couple of years. But I'm using my MBA to get some exposure to professional careers, you could say, that I don't have necessarily have I haven't necessarily had exposure to in the past.
Yeah. Um, so you're gonna be doing I recently talked to someone about the different types of MBA, so you'd be doing a full-time one then, right?
I'm doing a full-time one,
And
full-time 2 year MBA.
what's the so obviously if you're doing a full-time one versus doing one of the part-time ones where you're also working, you'd probably be putting more time into it. But are you actually learning like a whole lot more when you do a full-time one? Or is it very similar?
I think the learning is probably similar, like the classes you take. I think as far as electives, you have more options when you take a full-time MBA. Also, not all schools have have a part-time MBA. So I think like the highest level schools that have part-time MBAs are I think Booth and Kellogg, which is U Chicago and Northwestern. But like Stanford, Harvard, et cetera, don't have part-time. So I think that also makes a difference. Um, but the big thing for me with the full time is so I think it's less academic. I think you can get a lot of the same coursework, a lot of the same like skill development from a practical coursework standpoint. I think the biggest difference is the experience, like the immersiveness of the experience. So I think the 2 year MBA is like a very immersive, the 2 year full time MBA is a very immersive experience. It's not just about coursework. It's honestly very little about coursework. It's much more about the broader experience. And so like you can, get funding from Stanford for the internships that you do over the summer. If you're like interested in doing something in the startup world, you can get startup funding for it. You're like around other students all the time. At the GSB, you live in residences, so it's almost like you're an undergrad again, and you're living around. And this is not atypical. I have a close friend, my roommate from Denver or from BCG is actually going to Tuck, so he's going to Dartmouth, and his is the same. So like you live in residences, and so you're around other people your age who are like passionate about different aspects of business and also bring high level of like business experience to the MBA program themselves. So if you're interested in a startup, like the person down the hall might have started something up in the last couple of years and might be running a startup at the moment. If you're interested in working in government, someone will have worked in government before they came to business school. And so I think that aspect of the immersive experience is a little bit more robust when you're doing the full-time program. And so I think for those reasons, that was the right choice for me. But I think at the same time, when you're doing a part-time program, you can work simultaneously. You could probably take on a bigger role, like even if you were to transition from working at a particular place to doing a 6-month internship, I think you could take on a bigger role than if you're in a full-time program. So I think there are trade-offs, but for me, the full-time program was the right choice. Also, BCG is paying for it, and they prefer the full-time program, so that was also a big reason.
Yeah. So if you Google best MBA programs in the world, on basically every ranking, Stanford's probably in the top three. Do you know what you did that got you accepted to the program?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think MBA admissions are not that dissimilar from undergrad admissions. I think I like to say I was actually pretty active in undergrad in supporting kids from my community and applying to college, which doesn't happen super often. And like my mantra has always been, I think there are like two streams that matter in college admissions or MBA admissions. I think number one, it's showing you can handle like the academics slash like the showing you can like handle the space, right? Or like thrive in this space. And so a lot of that is like showing you have the academic competence in the business school context, is showing you have the professional experiences to contribute. And so I think that's stream number one. I think stream number two is showing that you're differentiated. And so like it's essentially showing why you specifically should be a part of the class and what you specifically can contribute to the class that maybe no one else can. And so I think for me, MBA admissions was slightly different because the first competence standpoint was very different than when I applied to undergrad at a high school. Out of high school, I had gone to like a low income public school, middle of nowhere, obviously applying to business school. I had gone to Yale and also had the BCG experience. And so I feel like the amount I had to leverage on showing that I could handle the material was maybe less than when I applied to undergrad. So for me, I think the biggest determiner of like my MBA application successes and failures were how I could show who I was as an individual. And so for me, it was a lot of the qualities about me that made me me. So it was what I was passionate about. I'm definitely still heavily involved and heavily engaged in the community I grew up in. So that was something that I highlighted. It will forever shape whatever career I do in the future. As I mentioned previously, I have a visual disability. I'm a very vocal advocate for it, and my future interests are also in accessibility technology. And so I definitely highlighted that as well. And so it was a lot about like I think your story, what makes you you, and like why you can contribute to the classroom in a way that others might not be able to. Um, and so yeah, I think that was the biggest differentiator for me. I spent a lot of time on my essays, and I really wrote from the heart, to say the least.
Yeah. So obviously MBAs are insanely expensive, and Boston Consulting Group wants you to get it. Uh, how do they think that MBA is going to improve you and make you a better worker for them?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's the key question. So I think the biggest piece BCG comes to gain. So basically, as you move up, I think there are two pieces. So number one, I think the lower hanging fruit. I'm a year from being a manager at BCG. So right now I'm a consultant. I started as an associate. You move up to consultant, and then after that you're a project leader. So you're a manager on whatever case that you're on. The PL role is like, or I would argue, like one of the hardest at BCG, like just because it's like the throwing you in the deep end of like suddenly you're managing four people in a client services context. And so I think the leadership skills you gain from business school can be like a super valuable experience. And so I think that's like the lowest hanging, but can't be unsaid. I think they expect you come out of the business school program having like, maybe tried a startup of your own and like had some kind of leadership experience there. Whatever it might be, like I think they expect you to business school expects you to engage in the leadership context, learn from a leadership standpoint, learn managerial skills, and I think those are super valuable in the near term of BCG. So I think that's one. I think the other big thing is BCG and consulting client services predicated on client relationships and selling work. So a big part of the BCG, like as you move up, you eventually become a partner, right? And once you're a partner, your whole job is to sell work. You're just selling client cases. And business school is valuable because it creates a very strong professional network of people who work in the world of corporations. And so from a BCG standpoint, it's like people from your Stanford Business School class will end up being VPs at Walmart, will end up being, work at the Gates Foundation as a deputy director, whatever it might be. And so they find you going to business school valuable because in the long run, those relationships are what the consulting industry is based on. And so I see that every day, like the partners that I work for, like they will be selling work, have relationships with people like that lived across the hall from them when they were at HBS or when they were at Kellogg. And yeah, so I think that's the other primary benefit that they see with us going to business school.
Yeah. So as my next question was about to be, what's like the main advantage of going to like such a prestigious school? But is it just the connections you get to build?
Yeah, so I think I would say it's twofold. Number one, the amount of resourcing is just higher. I think the amount of money that these schools have. I'll say resourcing from two contexts. I think number one, from like the amount of funding you can get. For example, at Stanford, there's a huge culture of entrepreneurship. If you start a startup, like you can get funding to push that forward. You can, like work over the summer and get paid to work over the summer, even though your startup's in stealth mode. And so I think that's super valuable. I think the other piece, I'll say resourcing from an intellectual standpoint. I think the coursework won't necessarily be like, that much better or that much different. But I think like the alumni network, you take GSB, like you have alums like Rishi Sunak, who's the former prime minister of the UK. Like There are several others, but the point all that's to say, like, you have like a lot of intellectual and professional power that you can lean on. Those are people who are like still heavily engaged or will heavily engage at different points in time with the GSB program. And so I think the opportunity to create those relationships is like right there for you to take. And I think that can't be undersaid. So I think resourcing is number one, and I think number two is definitely like the kind of environment, the kind of peer environment that you're in. And so like Stanford Business School is a competitive business school, and an implication of that is like most of the people or all of the people who are in your class have just done like amazing things. To be clear, this is also true of like a ton of MBA programs. So I'm not saying this is just a Stanford thing by any means, not remotely true. But like I will say what I'm excited about at Stanford Business School is just the quality and the like passion that my peers have in whatever they've done in the past and whatever they're interested in the future. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. I really think if you have any career interest, you can find someone in your program who has either like spent a lot of time in that industry or is also passionate about entering that industry or that particular role. And that can be a pretty unique experience. So
Yeah. Uh, I wanted to ask you about what work you're doing back in your hometown.
yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple pieces to that. I think the primary thing this I've been interested in, I heavily invested in college as well. So I was heavily invested in an organization called Matriculate. And it's a nonprofit organization that helps low income kids from low income kids from the US navigate the college application process. So the idea is it's primarily students who are interested in applying to like let's say like the top 50 to 60 schools in the US. And it's a lot of kids who like do not have, college quality college advising in the school context. And so I've guided like many students through the college application process who grew up in similar environments to myself. And that's super enriching. They both match you from a regional context, and so I primarily worked with kids from Eastern New Mexico, West Texas, which is where I grew up. And I've also like I am also a vocal advocate for Matriculate in rural schools, particularly in New Mexico. I'm really passionate about my home state. And so like through that program, for example, I like supported a kid from Bovina, which is right across the Texas border. And he was absolutely incredible. He's now a senior at Stanford. And like he actually made national news for getting into he got into every Ivy but Dartmouth. They got into like Stanford, MIT, et cetera. And was a first generation immigrant from Mexico. And so been a super meaningful experience for me. It keeps me involved in the college application process, which is kind of cool. But yeah, it's a bit passing it forward for me. The other piece I'll say is I still talk pretty regularly at my high school, so this is somewhat related context, but it's I think broader than the college application process. And so I still have relationships with my high school teachers. It was a small public school. And so anytime I come back, I usually I have like a couple of teachers that I'm particularly close with. And so I'll speak to like ninth through senior year or ninth through 12th graders, just about like what I ended up doing from my town, and showing them the path that I took, which is not necessarily the path that they might be interested in, but might give them some exposure to what's possible or what's available for them. So I think those are like the two primary avenues. I still engage with my hometown. My parents still live here. A lot of my friends are here or somewhat involved with being here. And so yeah, uh, we'll always love rural Eastern New Mexico.
Yeah. So for my last question, I wanted to ask what advice you would give someone who's still in high school or early in college wanting to go down a similar career path as you.
Yeah. So I think my biggest piece of advice is the decision you make now is not necessarily, it might be, but is not necessarily like the career you're going to end up doing for the rest of your life. And that is 100% okay. And so I think the implication of that is whatever you feel like you are interested in doing in a given moment, just leap in. If after a couple months, if after a semester of taking courses, you realize this is maybe not what I'm primarily interested in and I want to pivot slightly. That happens all the time. I think that happens throughout the journey. It can happen in high school where you're like, you apply with a particular major and then you quickly realize, like now that I've gotten a little bit more exposure to physics, I'm not sure if I want to do a physics PhD anymore. Very, very valid. People change in college. Even if you go to a school where you apply to the engineering department, you can definitely pivot outside of the engineering department if you realize I like engineering, but I like physics more, right? And then the same is true from the work context. The first job you have is absolutely not the last job you'll have. I would say in today's world, that's like 100% not how it works. And so yeah, keep an open mind, and in doing that, just like dive into whatever you're interested in the moment. If you find out that's not what you want to do for the rest of your life, that's totally fine. It'll still be a valuable learning experience. And so that's my biggest recommendation. Other thing I'll tout, I think heading into college, some people have more exposure than others. I think this podcast is a fantastic way to gain exposure. I love this idea. Um, but know that there are a lot of careers out there beyond like what might be the most obvious for you. And so like for example, right now I think computer science roles are definitely front and center, especially if you live on the West Coast. And I think there are a lot of roles even at tech companies that are not directly like working as a computer scientist that might be a better fit, might be something you're interested in, you never know. And so the broader point is spend some time researching, talking to people who like work in careers, whether you know or whether you think you might be interested in it or not, because you never know what might spark your interest moving forward. And so yeah, that's my advice for the future generation, navigating the high school, college, career trajectory.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that great message. But yeah.